I need to tell you something before this story starts. Most people who fall for the wrong person figure it out eventually. They find the red flags. They connect the dots. They escape. Nora Voss found the red flags too. Every single one. The problem? They weren't red flags at all. They were breadcrumbs, and they'd been left for her, specifically, deliberately, years before she ever met him. By the one person she thought she'd lost forever. By the time she understood what she was holding, she was already in love, already in danger, and already the most important person in a war she didn't know existed. Here's what I want you to pay attention to as this story unfolds. The thing that makes Nora feel most invisible, the thing she is most ashamed of, is the exact thing that saves everyone. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. You'll know it when you see it. And when you do, I promise you, you'll want to go back to the very beginning and read it all over again. So before we go any further, if you've never been here before, or if you've been here 100 times and somehow still haven't hit that button, this is your moment. Like this video? Subscribe. Because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those ones that stays with you. The kind you think about in the quiet. The kind that makes you want to call someone you love and just tell them. And there are more stories like this coming. Stories that will make this one feel like just the beginning. So don't miss them. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Because people are watching this from places I never imagined. And every single comment reminds me why I keep telling these stories. For you. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The first thing you need to know about Nora Voss is that she was the kind of person rooms forgot about. Not in a cruel way. Not in a way anyone would have been proud of if you'd pointed it out to them. Just, she had a talent, refined over years of quiet practice, for existing in spaces without disturbing them. She moved through Hollowick's only public library every morning the way light moves through glass. Present, passing through, leaving everything exactly as she found it. She had a ritual. Every morning before the library opened at 9, she arrived at 8:15, unlocked the side door with the key that had left a permanent indent on her palm, and she shelved. Not randomly. Never randomly. She knew every book in that building by its spine. The cracked red leather of the Hollowick Historical Atlas. The sun-faded green of the complete folklore anthology on shelf 7. The paperbacks in the community lending section, soft and curved from hundreds of hands. She could walk that library in the dark and never knock a single thing over. She called it calibrating. Her mother called it avoidance. The truth, as it usually does, lived somewhere in the middle. Tucked behind the reference section, behind the local history volumes that nobody ever touched except Nora, was a journal. Dark blue cover, spiral bound, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at a pharmacy and somehow only ever use one of. She kept it there because it was the one place in Hollowick she was certain nobody would look. Not her mother, not the library's other part-time employee, a 71-year-old man named Gerald, who moved at approximately the speed of administrative processing and asked Nora the Wi-Fi password every single day, despite having worked there for 9 years. She'd started the journal 7 years ago. She called it, privately, the file. There was a photograph on her desk. Small, slightly tilted. She'd straightened it so many times that leaving it tilted had become its own kind of habit. In it, a woman in her late 20s stood beside a man with kind eyes and a field researcher's vest, both of them grinning in that unguarded way people only grin when they don't know the camera is pointing at them. The woman was Nora. The man was her father. She touched the corner of the frame once, the way she did every morning, and then she went to work. Hollowick. If you've never had the particular experience of growing up in a town where everyone knows not just your name but your grandmother's opinions, is the kind of place that looks completely ordinary at first glance and slightly wrong at the second. Population 3,200. One grocery store, one diner, one library, and a local council that had been arguing about whether to repave the main road since 2014. The kind of town where the news cycle runs about 6 weeks behind everywhere else, and the biggest controversy of any given year involves either a zoning dispute or someone's dog. But there was a forest at the northern edge of Hollowick, and nobody, in Nora's memory, had ever really talked about it the way you talk about a normal forest. They talked around it. They mentioned it the way you might mention a relative who'd done something nobody discussed at dinner, with a kind of careful, practiced neutrality that was its own form of acknowledgement. Old families, old stories. She'd grown up hearing fragments. Wolves in the old records, a founding bloodline that had protected the land for longer than the town itself had had a name. She'd cataloged those stories herself, here in this very library, in archives that nobody else thought worth their time. She'd filed them under local folklore and told herself it was just history. She had been, as it turned out, spectacularly wrong about what it was. But that comes later. Her father's name was Roland Voss. He had been, a wildlife researcher, which meant that the forest at Hollowick's edge was, professionally speaking, exactly his kind of place. He'd gone into it on a Thursday in late October, 7 years ago, when Nora was 16 and still at the age where she could not imagine a version of the world that didn't have him in it. He had taken his field pack, his notebook, and his good boots. He had kissed her mother on the cheek and told Nora he'd be back by Sunday. He was not back by Sunday. No body was ever found, no note, no distress signal, no damaged equipment, nothing that pointed in any clear direction. The official investigation lasted 11 weeks and concluded that Roland Voss had likely experienced an accident in difficult terrain, a fall, an injury, exposure, and that recovery was not probable. Case closed. A small memorial in the churchyard. A very kind letter from his university department. Nora's mother, Diane, had grieved the way some people grieve, fully, with intention, in stages that more or less followed the expected sequence. She had cried. She had been angry. She had eventually, incrementally, rebuilt a life around the shape of what was missing. She visited the memorial. She kept his photo on the mantel. She moved forward because that is what the living are asked to do. Nora had never quite managed the moving forward part. Not out of denial. She was clear-eyed enough to know he was probably gone in every way that practically mattered. But there was something in the base of her chest, some piece of her that operated below the level of reasonable grief, that had simply refused, quietly, stubbornly, without drama, to file the case as closed. It was instinct more than hope. The feeling of a sentence that hadn't reached its period yet. So she kept the file. It had started as notes. Things she remembered, questions she couldn't stop asking. Small inconsistencies in the official report that nagged at her the way a splinter nags before you can see it. Over 7 years, it had grown into something considerably more involved. She had once, in a particularly focused stretch of investigative energy, spent 3 months constructing a color-coded timeline of her father's last known movements on her bedroom wall. Photographs, dates, archive printouts, red thread, the full aesthetic. Her mother had walked in one afternoon, stood in the doorway for a long moment taking it in, and then said very carefully, "Sweetheart, that's either a breakthrough or a cry for help, and I genuinely can't tell which." Nora had considered this. "Neither can I," she'd said. They'd had tea after that and not discussed it further. Which was, honestly, the most functional coping mechanism either of them had managed. Among the things in the file were her father's letters. The last ones he'd sent, a handful of them, in the 3 months before he disappeared. Ordinary letters, the kind fathers write to teenage daughters when they're in the field, and phone signal is unreliable. Weather updates, descriptions of what he'd seen. Small jokes, references to books she'd mentioned, suggestions for ones she hadn't read yet. She'd read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She kept them at the back of the file. She didn't think about why. She would, eventually, but not yet. It was a Tuesday in early spring. The kind of morning where the rain hadn't decided yet whether it was done, when the library door opened 20 minutes before the official start of business, which should have been impossible because Nora was fairly certain she'd locked it behind her. She looked up from the cart she was unloading. In the doorway stood a man she had never seen before in Hollowick, which in a town of 3,200 was itself a minor event. He was tall in the specific way that makes door frames look provisional. He was soaking wet, thoroughly, completely. The kind of wet that implied he had either walked a significant distance in the rain or had made a series of increasingly questionable decisions about umbrella ownership. He was holding, with the careful gravity of a man delivering important documents, a paperback book that had clearly suffered an event of some kind. The cover was warped. The pages had bloomed outward at the edges, the way wet paper does when it dries wrong. It looked, objectively, like a book that had survived something. He looked at Nora. She looked at the book. He said, in a low, serious voice that she would later describe as having absolutely no business being that composed given the circumstances, "Is there a fine for returning a book that's been weathered?" Nora looked at the book again, then back at him. "Sir," she said, "that book has been murdered." Something shifted in his expression, not a full smile, more the controlled precursor to one, like a door opening a careful inch. He laughed, low and brief, and the sound of it did something unreasonable to the air in the room. She turned red. She did not do this visibly, she hoped. She was fairly certain she did it visibly. He told her his name. Caden Reese. He'd recently moved to Hollowick. He was staying at the Greystone estate, out on the eastern edge of town. The old one with the stone walls and the reputation that people mentioned in the same carefully neutral tone they used for the northern forest. He said he was in land development. He paid the replacement fee for the book without being asked, which she noted. He said he hoped he hadn't caused a problem, coming in early. She said it was fine. He said thank you and left. She watched the door for approximately 4 seconds after it closed. Then she went back to her cart. She told herself it was just a crush. She'd had crushes before. They passed. The way rain passes, and the way small embarrassments pass, and the way most things pass, when you give them enough time and enough quiet. This one would too. She was completely, catastrophically wrong about that. But she didn't know it yet, so we'll let her have the moment. He came back on Thursday with another book, this one with a coffee ring on the cover that had no clear explanation. Then the following Tuesday, then Thursday again. It became, without either of them formally deciding it was, a rhythm. The books came back in increasingly creative states of distress. A torn spine. A page with what appeared, and she studied it carefully before concluding this, to be a claw mark. When she raised an eyebrow at that one, he said, without inflection, "Dog." She said, "That's a very literary dog." He smiled, and Nora Voss, who had spent 7 years being the person that rooms forgot about, felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could clearly remember. She felt noticed. The conversations grew the way good things do. Not by announcement, but by accumulation. Books, to start. Then the history of Hollowick, which she knew better than almost anyone. Then the old folklore she'd spent years cataloging. The wolves in the founding records, the bloodline stories, the odd consistency of the old descriptions. He listened to those with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not dismissive. Not amused. Something more careful than either. Like a man hearing a version of a story he already knows and paying very close attention to what details this particular teller has noticed. She thought she was imagining it. It was a Wednesday when she stopped imagining things. The library closed at 7. Caden had stayed late. He'd started doing that, claiming, implausibly, to be a slow reader, which was transparently false for a man who returned 3 books a week in various states of non-structural integrity. At 10 minutes to close, the door opened, and a man she didn't recognize walked in. He didn't look at the shelves. He didn't look at her. He walked directly to where Caden was sitting and leaned down and said something, very quietly, that she couldn't hear. And Caden changed, not gradually, instantly. Every trace of the man she'd been talking to for weeks, the warmth, the dry humor, the careful attentiveness, gone. What replaced it was something else entirely. Not cruelty. Something more absolute than cruelty. The stillness of a thing that is used to being the most dangerous presence in any given space and does not need to announce it. He stood up, looked at the stranger, said 2 words. "Handle it." The stranger left, immediately, like a soldier released from attention. Caden turned back to her. The warmth was back, perfectly restored, like a mask he'd lifted and replaced in a single fluid motion. He smiled, said it was getting late, said, "Same time Thursday?" She said yes. She watched him leave. She locked the door behind him and stood in the quiet of the empty library for a moment. Then she walked to the reference section, reached behind the local history volumes, pulled out the dark blue journal, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote in the center of it 1 line. "Who are you, Caden Reese?" She stared at it for a while. Then she closed the journal, put it back, turned off the lights. She had spent 7 years asking questions that nobody answered. She was, by this point, exceptionally good at not giving up. And somewhere across town, in the Greystone estate at the edge of Hollowick, a man sat alone in the dark and asked himself, with an expression no one was there to see, the exact same question about her. Chapter 2. She gave it 3 days. This was, for Nora Voss, an act of considerable restraint. 3 days of shelving books and helping Gerald reset his library card password, the same password he'd had for 9 years, which was Gerald 1, and which he forgot with the reliability of a natural phenomenon. And smiling at patrons and doing every ordinary thing the day asked of her, while the name Reese sat in the back of her mind like a stone in a shoe. On the 4th morning, she arrived at 7 instead of 8:15. She unlocked the archive room, and she got to work. She started where any reasonable investigation starts, on paper. Land registry records for the Greystone estate, business filings for Reese Property Development, which was registered in the state and had a clean enough record. A handful of completed projects in other counties, a functioning website that was professional without being informative. The kind of corporate presence that said we exist without saying much else. Like a frame around an empty canvas. Real, but thin. She tried social media next. She was thorough about it. She checked everything. She spent, she would later admit to no one, slightly longer than was proportionate trying to find a single profile, a tagged photo, a comment on a local business review, anything. There was nothing. Not one trace. The absence of social media in a 30-year-old man is, statistically speaking, either evidence of profound emotional maturity or profound criminal activity. She had not ruled either out. She might have stopped there, filed it under private person, nothing conclusive, and let it go. She was aware that this would have been the sensible decision. She was also aware that she had never once in her adult life made the sensible decision when an unanswered question was sitting directly in front of her. She went deeper. The historical archives of Hollowick were not, technically speaking, available to the general public. They were available to library staff with access to the lower archive room, which was a distinction that had never mattered before, because Nora was the only library staff member who had ever voluntarily entered the lower archive room. Gerald had been down there once, in 2019, and described it afterward as a lot of boxes, with the energy of a man who had seen enough. The founding records of Hollowick went back 340 years. Nora had catalogued most of them herself over several years of slow and careful work, because they were deteriorating and no one else was going to do it. She knew them the way she knew the library's shelves, by texture and position, and the particular smell of paper at different stages of age. She pulled the earliest land records, the property histories, the council minutes from the first 100 years of the town's formal existence. The name appeared in the second document she opened. Reese. She sat with that for a moment, then she kept reading. It was in the third document too, and the seventh, and in a survey record from 1809, and a council notation from 1871, and a deed transfer from 1923. Always the Greystone estate. Always the same family. Generation after generation. The name Reese attached to that property with a consistency that went so far beyond coincidence, it had lapped it entirely and arrived somewhere else. And beside it, not in every record, but in enough of them, in the oldest ones especially, in the language of people who wrote things down differently when they assumed no one unfamiliar would ever read them. The same phrase. Keeper of the boundary, guardian of the pack. Nora sat back in her chair. She looked at the document in her hands, then at the stack of others on the table, then at the archive room around her, full of 3 centuries of a town's carefully kept secrets, which she had personally catalogued and filed and shelved without fully understanding what she was handling. She said out loud to no one, "Okay, that's a lot." She sat with it for 3 more days, which brought her to the night she made the decision she would later describe, with the clarity of hindsight, as objectively unwise but, given who she was, more or less inevitable. It wasn't just the archive records. It was the lights. 2 nights running, she'd seen them from her bedroom window. Not her bedroom, actually, but the upstairs bathroom, which faced north, which she'd started visiting with suspicious frequency around 10 p.m. for reasons she wasn't fully examining. Lights in the northern forest behind the Greystone estate. Moving. Steady and deliberate. Not the random scatter of someone with a torch navigating unfamiliar ground, but the organized movement of people who knew exactly where they were going. And sounds. Low, distant, carried on the wind with just enough clarity to be maddening. Not words, not quite, but rhythm and register. The sound of a voice that carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. She told herself she was going to observe from a safe distance. She put on her jacket. She walked the 20 minutes to the estate. She stood at the gate for approximately 45 seconds. Then she went in. The front door was unlocked, which she registered as significant, either a careless oversight or a deliberate invitation, and neither option was entirely comfortable. The ground floor was sparse in the deliberate way of a space that has been arranged to reveal nothing. Plain furniture, neutral walls, the faint smell of pine, and something older she couldn't name. There was nothing here that told you anything about the person who lived in it. But there was a door at the back of the hallway, slightly ajar, and from behind it, a warm light came from somewhere below, and a voice, Caden's voice, unmistakable, drifted up through the gap. She crossed the hallway, put her hand on the doorframe. The words came clearer as she listened. The northern boundary is our first priority. If they move on the eastern ridge, we respond with presence, not engagement. And the humans in town, all of them, remain under full protection. That is non-negotiable. Nora stood very still. Then she pushed the door open and walked down the stairs. What she had expected, if she had constructed an expectation, which she was honest enough with herself to admit she had, was something that matched the weight of what she'd heard. Something dark, perhaps. Dramatic. At minimum, something that justified the cold feeling that had been following her since she'd read the words "Guardian of the Pack" in a document written 200 years before she was born. What she found was a basement room with stone walls and warm lighting and a large wooden table around which sat approximately 12 people of varying ages. There were chairs, there were papers, there were 2 separate ceramic dishes in the center of the table that were unmistakably, undeniably food. One appeared to be a green salad. The other was a casserole. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at the casserole. At the head of the table, his back to her, stood Caden. He had stopped speaking mid-sentence, and then, slowly, every single person in the room turned to look at her. Not with surprise. With the unhurried, collective attention of people who have known exactly where she is for considerably longer than she'd been standing there. The silence was enormous. It pressed against her ears. She looked around the room. She looked at Caden, who had turned fully now, his expression doing something complicated and careful that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She looked at the 12 people watching her with the patient, slightly resigned energy of people who have rehearsed for a version of this moment and are now watching it go slightly differently than planned. She looked at the casserole. She said, "Is that a chicken casserole? Because I haven't eaten since noon, and if I'm about to have a breakdown, I'd like to do it on a full stomach." Someone at the far end of the table laughed, short and genuine, immediately stifled. Caden closed his eyes, just for a second. The expression on his face was not irritation. It was something closer to the look of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has just felt, unexpectedly, the grip loosen. They cleared out quietly. No fuss, no scene. Just people gathering papers and exchanging brief looks and filing up the stairs with the practiced efficiency of a group that has held many meetings and knows when one is over. Within 4 minutes, the room was empty except for Nora and Caden. She sat down. He sat across from her. He told her the truth. Not all of it. She understood later that he gave her what she could hold without the ground disappearing entirely. But enough. Hollowick had been pack territory for over 300 years. Not the horror story kind. A community. Families who had lived alongside the human population of the town through generations of careful, deliberate coexistence. His family, the Reese bloodline, had held the alpha position for 6 generations. When his father died 4 years ago, the pack fractured. An outside force, a pack led by a man named Dovin, brutal and expansionist, had been circling ever since, testing the edges, looking for the moment weakness became an opening. He had come back to Hollowick to rebuild, to hold what his family had bled to protect. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She was good at listening. 7 years of practicing it had made her very good indeed. And then, when he finished, she asked the question that had been sitting at the base of her throat since he'd said the words northern boundary, in a voice that knew exactly where the northern boundary was. My father was a wildlife researcher. He disappeared into the forest north of Hollowick 7 years ago. They said it was an accident. She kept her voice level. Did you know him? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted. She watched something move across Caden's face. Not guilt, not precisely, but the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and has just felt someone else's hand close around it. Something between relief and dread. The face of a person arriving at a moment they knew was coming and still weren't entirely ready for. He said, Yes. Oh, I knew Roland Voss. What followed remade the last 7 years in about 6 minutes. Her father had not been only a wildlife researcher. He had been the pack's human witness, a role older than the town itself, held by a trusted human who knew the truth, who kept records, who served as both archive and conscience for the pack's leadership. Roland had sought them out himself, years before Nora was old enough to understand what any of it meant, drawn by the same instinct for unanswered questions that Nora had inherited without knowing its origin. The previous Alpha had trusted him completely. 7 years ago, Roland had discovered something. Evidence that Dovin's people had already placed someone inside the pack, an infiltrator, feeding information outward. He had gone into the northern forest deliberately, alone, to confirm it before bringing it forward. He had not come back. There were signs of a struggle. No body. Caden's father had died 6 months later, grief and fracture hollowing him from the inside. Caden had been 23. He had inherited an alpha title and a broken pack and a war he hadn't started. And one of the first things he had quietly, privately vowed, in the way that young men make vows when they are standing in the wreckage of everything their fathers built, was that if Roland Voss had left behind a family, he would watch over them. He had known who she was from the day he walked through the library door. He had come looking for her. The room was very quiet. Nora stood up. She was not entirely sure when she'd decided to do that. It happened the way some movements happen, before the conscious decision catches up. She looked at him across the table, and she started to say something. Something about the last 6 months, about Tuesdays and Thursdays, about the fact that she had apparently been developing feelings for, and she stopped. Because she had just said developing feelings out loud in the same sentence as his name, and Caden's expression had done something involuntary and immediate and careful and reverent that she was completely unprepared for. She sat back down. She took a breath. Refocused. Do you think he's alive? Caden looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she understood he was not going to soften the answer in either direction. I think it's possible, he said. And I think you're the one who's going to help me find out. She held that, turned it over, set it down somewhere in her chest next to 7 years of the same stubborn, ungrieved instinct that had told her the story wasn't finished. She'd spent 7 years cataloging other people's stories. She was starting to understand that she had been living inside one the whole time, and that the author had been her father. If this chapter just did something to your chest, you're not alone. Before we go any further into this story, do something for me. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because Chapter 3 is where everything changes, and you do not want to miss it. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? I read them. Every single one. Now, Let's keep going. Chapter 3. The map room was on the second floor of the Greystone estate, behind a door that looked like every other door in the hallway, until you opened it and found something that resembled the inside of Nora's mind, made physical. Territorial maps pinned to boards. Handwritten records going back generations, stacked in careful towers. A long oak table that had clearly hosted 100 years of serious decisions before she arrived, and covered a third of it in color-coded journals. She hadn't planned to bring all 7 years of the file. She told herself she was bringing the relevant sections. She brought everything. Caden had looked at the volume of material she'd carried through his front door and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Can I get you a coffee?" "Please," she said. And possibly a second table." They worked through 2 weeks of evenings. The rhythm of it established itself quickly. Her reading aloud observations she'd noted years ago without understanding their significance. Him listening with that quality of attention she'd first noticed in the library, the kind that felt like being taken seriously. She would connect something. A date in her father's notes to a territorial incident in the pack records. A pattern in the wildlife sightings Roland had logged to a known movement route of Dovin's people. And she'd look up and find Caden watching her with an expression she was learning to recognize. The first time it happened, she'd said, "What?" He'd said, "Nothing. Keep going." She had kept going, but she'd filed it. She was, after all, very good at filing things. The pack warmed to her in the way of people who don't make announcements about it. One evening, she arrived to find a mug already set out at her usual spot. Not a spare mug. Her mug. The specific one she'd used 3 times and apparently claimed without realizing. Another evening, without anyone saying a word about it, the chair closest to the fire was empty when every other chair was taken, as though it had been quietly reserved. She noticed these things the way she noticed most things. Precisely, privately, with a feeling she didn't quite have words for yet. She had never, she was realizing, been welcomed anywhere. She had been tolerated, accommodated, occasionally appreciated. But welcomed was different. Welcomed meant someone had thought of you before you arrived. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she did what she did with most things that overwhelmed her. She cataloged it, put it somewhere safe, and kept working. It was on the 11th evening, when the maps were put away and the papers were stacked, and the fire had gone down to the comfortable low burn of a room settling into late night, that she asked him the question she'd been considering for days. "What was it like?" she said. "Inheriting all of this at 23? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he set down his coffee and looked at the table and said, "Terrifying." Just the one word. But the way he said it, without performance, without the careful control she'd learned to recognize as his default register, told her it cost him something to say it plainly. He had been 23, and the pack was fractured, and his father was 4 months in the ground, and Dovin's people were already moving on the outer boundaries. No transition, no preparation, just the title, the responsibility, and the specific horror of understanding that every decision he made from that point forward had consequences measured in people he knew by name. "So I made a choice," he said. "I made myself cold, not because it was what I was, but because warmth looked like weakness, and weakness was an invitation. To the packs watching from the outside, to anyone inside who was wondering if the new alpha was going to hold." Nora considered this. The ruthless reputation. You built it deliberately. Yes. Does it work? The corner of his mouth moved. Nobody attacked us for 3 years. A beat. Nah, until last week. Right, she said. There is that. The fire settled. Outside, the night was quiet in the way that Hollowick nights were quiet. A quiet that had texture to it, that breathed. She looked at his hands resting on the table. They were still. Completely, precisely still, in the way that she had learned was not natural stillness but constructed stillness. The physical equivalent of everything else he'd described. Deliberate, controlled. A performance of calm so practiced it had almost become indistinguishable from the real thing. Almost. She said, "You don't have to do that here." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on his hands, because looking at his face felt like too much information at once. The silence stretched out for long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated. That she'd reached for something he wasn't ready to offer. Then, without a word, she watched the deliberate tension release from his hands. Slowly. The way something held for a long time opens when it finally trusts the surface it's resting on. He looked at her for a long time after that. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, and the thing that lived in the space between them, which had been building for weeks with the patient inevitability of weather, got considerably louder. Thursday came the way bad things tend to come when everything else is going well, without warning and with very poor timing. It was early evening. Nora was at the estate, working through a cross-reference she'd nearly resolved, when the atmosphere changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in how the building sounded. The particular quality of quiet that is not peace, but held breath. Then 2 pack members came through the door at speed, and Caden was on his feet before they'd finished the first sentence, and she understood from the way he moved, instantly, completely, that something had broken. Dovin's scouts had hit the northern boundary. 3 of Caden's people were injured. The breach was contained, but real. She stayed out of the way and watched him work. She had thought, before this, that she understood what ruthless meant in the context of Caden Reese. She had heard the word from pack members who used it with a complicated mixture of respect and something that wasn't quite unease, but lived near it. She'd built a picture from the fragments. Decisions made without visible hesitation, a reputation that kept threats at a distance. The way other packs apparently said his name with the specific brevity reserved for things that require no elaboration. What she saw that evening was something she hadn't had a framework for before she witnessed it. He walked into the chaos of 3 injured people and a compromised boundary, and he made it stop. Not through force, through clarity. 3 decisions in the space of 2 minutes, each one delivered with the quiet authority of a man who has already run every calculation and is simply announcing the result. No visible fear. No hesitation. No cost. Or at least, nothing that looked like cost from the outside. She understood, watching him, why he was feared. Not because he was cruel. Because he was a wall. And walls don't bleed where anyone can see. Afterward, she found him at the far edge of the estate grounds, standing at the tree line in the dark, his back to the building. She walked out and stood beside him and didn't say anything for a while. Let the quiet settle between them like something they'd both agreed to. Then she said, "That's why they call you ruthless, isn't it? Not because you're cruel. Because you refuse to let them see that it cost you anything." He didn't answer, but he held his hands out, slightly away from his body, where the low light from the estate windows caught them. They were shaking. Just slightly, just enough. She looked at them. She looked at him, and the enormity of what it meant, that he was showing her this, specifically her. The one person he'd let pass the wall, sat in her chest like something precious and heavy all at once. She took a breath to say something. She didn't know what exactly. Something true, something that matched the weight of the moment. And then a low alert tone sounded from somewhere on his person, and he straightened, and the wall went back up so fast it was almost physical. "Nora, go inside, please." She went. She crossed the grass toward the estate door, and she didn't look back until she reached it. And when she did, he was already moving away into the dark, and the line of his shoulders carried everything he refused to put down. She went inside. The message arrived the following morning. It was not long. Dovin, she would learn, was not a man who used more words than necessary. He had Roland Voss, had held him for 7 years, taken him the night Roland went into the forest to confirm the infiltrator's identity before the proof could be delivered. Roland was alive. Dovin's price for his return was the Alpha title and the surrender of Hollowick's territory. Nora read it at the map room table, Caden standing at the window with his back to her. She put it down very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady, and you are not going to let that show. "He's been alive," she said. "This whole time, he's been alive." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Then something shifted in her chest, through the shock, through the disbelief, clean and clarifying as cold water, and she stood up. "Caden." He turned. "Don't you dare surrender that title." "Nora." "My father spent 7 years as a prisoner," she said, and her voice was entirely level, which surprised even her. "Rather than give up what he went to find. 7 years, he held. He did not break. I am not going to stand here and let you dishonor that by handing everything he protected to the man who took him." The room was quiet. Then Caden said, with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words from a very specific, limited selection, "So what do we do?" And Nora, 7 years of journals, 7 years of questions without answers, daughter of a man who had trusted her with something enormous without ever being able to say so, looked at him and said, "We do what he went to do. We deliver the proof, and I think I know where he hid it." She didn't know yet that she was right. She didn't know yet that the proof had been in her hands for 7 years, sewn into the fabric of the most ordinary things, folded into the creases of letters she had read so many times they had gone soft at the edges, hidden in the margins of words a father had written to his daughter because he loved her and because he knew that invisible things survive. She would know soon. We are so close to the ending, and I promise you, it is not what you think. If you're not subscribed yet, do it right now before Chapter 4 starts, because this is the kind of ending you'll want to tell someone about. Like this video, hit subscribe, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know you're here. Now, one more chapter. Chapter 4. She went to the library at midnight. Not because it was a reasonable hour to go to a library. Because she couldn't sleep, and because the proof was somewhere, and because the only place she had ever been able to think clearly was surrounded by books, and because her father had known that about her long before she did. She unlocked the side door with the key that had left a permanent indent on her palm, and she turned on only the lamp at her desk. The small one, the one that made a warm circle of light just large enough to work in, and she spread everything out. 7 journals, all of Roland's letters, her own notes from the past 2 weeks, the archive records, everything. She sat in the middle of it and looked at it for a long time. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She was operating on something below the level of logic. The same instinct that had kept the file open for 7 years, that had never let her write the word closed on the question of her father. She trusted it the way you trust the part of yourself that has never lied to you. even when it made no practical sense. She started with the letters, the last ones, the 3 months before he disappeared. She had read them so many times she could have recited them. She knew the rhythm of his sentences, the specific way he moved from observation to humor to something quietly tender that he expressed sideways because he was a man who found directness in emotional matters slightly embarrassing. She knew the letters the way you know a song, not just the words, but the breathing spaces between them. Which is why, though when she looked at the 4th letter with fresh eyes at midnight, she caught something she had never caught before. A margin note. Small, her father's handwriting compressed into the white space beside the 3rd paragraph. Not an afterthought. Deliberate, placed with precision. A book title, a specific one. And beside it, a number that looked like a date but wasn't, that she recognized, after a moment of stillness, as a library call number. Her breath caught. She got up, crossed the library without turning on any additional lights. She didn't need them. And she found the book, pulled it from the shelf, opened it. Inside the front cover, folded flat against the binding, was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it. Read it. Yana sat down on the floor of the aisle between shelves 7 and 8 because her legs made an executive decision without consulting her. Then she went back to the letters. Now that she knew what she was looking for, it was, and this would make her laugh later, in the way that things which are almost unbearable become funny once they're survivable. Everywhere. He had been thorough. He had been meticulous. He had been, in every way that counted, her father's daughter, without either of them ever discussing it. The first letters of specific sentences, read sequentially, forming words. Book references that weren't recommendations but coordinates. Margin notes so small and precise they were invisible unless you were looking, and invisible to everyone except the one person he'd known would spend years reading those letters with the exact, exhausting attention she gave to everything she loved. One book led to another to a third, each one in the library's collection, books she had personally catalogued, handled, shelved. The evidence Roland Voss had gathered about Dovin's infiltrator inside the pack had been distributed across 7 books in Hollowick's public library for 7 years. Tucked inside the spines of volumes that nobody touched except the quiet girl at the desk who knew every book by its spine. She assembled the full picture at 2:43 in the morning. She sat with it for a long time, understanding not just what her father had done, but why. He had known, in those last weeks, that he was being watched. He had known that whatever he carried on his person, or stored in any obvious place, would be found and taken if something happened to him. So he had looked for the safest hiding place he could imagine. He had chosen her, not despite her invisibility, because of it. Because she was the one person in Hollowick that nobody would think to look at twice. Because the proof, distributed across the books of a library, tended by a shy, quiet girl who cataloged things and kept her head down and disappeared into the background of every room she entered, was the proof that would never be found. He had trusted her with the most important thing he had. He had just never been able to tell her. She pressed her hand flat against the open letter on the desk in front of her. The paper was soft at the folds. It smelled faintly of something she couldn't name and didn't try to. She said quietly to the empty library, "Hi, Dad, I hear you." And then she cried. Properly, fully. The kind of crying she hadn't allowed herself in 7 years, because there was always a reason to hold it together, and hold it together, and hold it together. She cried for about 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, gathered the evidence into a careful, ordered stack, and went to find Caden. He was awake. She had not expected him to be asleep. She laid it out on the map room table, all of it in sequence, with the precision of a woman who has spent her entire adult life organizing information for other people and is now, for the first time, doing it for herself. She explained what she'd found and how. She walked him through her father's method, the books, the letters, the margin notes too small for anyone else to catch. She watched his face as she talked. She had become, over the past 2 weeks, fairly fluent in the language of Caden Reese's expressions. The small vocabulary of shifts and adjustments that he allowed himself in place of the wider emotional range he kept locked down. But what moved across his face as she laid out the full picture of what Roland had done, what he'd trusted his daughter to carry without knowing she was carrying it, was something she hadn't seen before. Something that looked, on a man that controlled, remarkably like being undone. He looked at the evidence, then at her, then at the evidence again. The infiltrator was named in Roland's documents with the quiet, irrefutable specificity of a man who had been a researcher his entire professional life. Dates, incidents, methods, communications, not accusations, facts, the kind that don't require volume or drama, the kind you simply set on a table and let speak. Caden called 3 people into the room. The documents were reviewed. The conclusion reached by everyone present, independently and within minutes, was the same. The infiltrator was removed from the estate before dawn. Without a scene, without the kind of confrontation that generates more damage than it resolves. The evidence was simply presented, and it held. Because truth, Roland Voss had apparently believed with his whole life, doesn't need to shout. One of the pack members, a broad, steady woman named Petra, who had always given Nora the impression of someone who had witnessed a great deal without being particularly surprised by any of it, paused on her way out of the room and looked at Nora with an expression that was as close to openly moved as Petra apparently got. "So," she said, "you've been carrying our entire pack's salvation in a box of old letters for 7 years?" Nora considered this. "To be fair," she said, "I didn't know that's what it was." Petra looked at her for a moment. "Neither did we," she said, and walked out. Dovin did not accept the collapse of his leverage gracefully. He came anyway. 3 days after the infiltrator was removed, when the information had already moved through the pack, and the border positions had already been adjusted based on what Roland's documents revealed. Dovin came with numbers and the particular fury of a man who has been holding a winning hand for 7 years and has arrived at the table to find the game has already been played without him. The confrontation was brutal, and it was costly, and it was real. 2 of Caden's people were seriously injured. The boundary held. It held because Caden had spent 4 years building something that could withstand exactly this. A pack that was not large, but was coherent. That had been rebuilt from fracture into something that understood what it was defending and why. Nora stayed inside the estate. She did not pretend this was easy. She sat in the map room, and she listened to the sounds from outside, and she held herself completely still the way Caden held his hands completely still, and she understood for the first time why he did it. Not because you're not afraid, but because the stillness is the only thing you can offer when the alternative is falling apart, and you cannot afford to fall apart right now. When it was over, she went outside. He was sitting on the front steps of the estate. She hadn't expected that either. She'd expected to find him upright, managing, performing the aftermath with the same controlled efficiency he brought to everything. Instead, he was sitting on the stone steps with his forearms on his knees and his head down, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who had used everything they had. She sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The night air was cold and clear, and the grounds were quiet in the specific way of places where something significant has just finished happening. Then she said, "Your hands are shaking again." "I know," he said. She reached over and took one of them, held it in both of hers. She felt the tremor in it, and she didn't say anything about it, and she didn't let go. He turned his head and looked at her, and the expression on his face, unguarded, entirely unperformed. The face of a man who has been holding the world at arm's length for 4 years and has just, in this moment, been given permission to set some of it down, was the most honest thing she had ever seen on another person. She held his hand. He let her, and the night settled around them like something that had been waiting a long time to be quiet. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning in early winter, Nora stood at the edge of the northern forest. Caden was slightly behind her. She was aware of him the way she had become aware of him in all things, specifically, warmly, without having to look. He had positioned himself back and to the left with the deliberate care of a man who understands that some moments belong entirely to someone else, and that the most important thing he can do right now is not be in the way of it. The forest was still, and then it wasn't. He came out slowly, using a stick, a real one, a branch shaped smooth by use. He was thinner than she remembered, and his hair had gone almost fully gray, and he walked with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to trust flat ground. But he was walking. He came out of the tree line, and he stopped when he saw her, and he stood there in the cold morning air and looked at her the way a man looks when he has been surviving on the hope of something for 7 years and is now standing in front of the proof that the hope was not a lie. She walked toward him, not running, walking. Because she understood, at 23, what she hadn't known at 16. That some moments are too important to rush, that the wanting to arrive doesn't mean you skip the ground between. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her like she was every good thing he'd managed to hold on to. She said, "You hit it in the books, Dad. I work in a library. A little on the nose, don't you think?" He laughed. The laugh broke open in the middle and became something else entirely. And then so did she. And they stood at the edge of the northern forest in the cold morning air and held on to each other with the specific, complete relief of people who have been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. Caden, at a respectful distance, became very interested in a patch of frost on the ground to his left. His jaw was set in the careful way of a man who is not, absolutely not, affected by what he is witnessing. He was very convincing. Almost entirely convincing. He did not convince anyone. The first week Roland was home, he and Nora sat at the kitchen table in the small house that smelled like lavender, and drank tea, and talked for hours at a stretch, filling in 7 years in the only way you can. Imperfectly, gratefully, with a lot of gaps that might never close fully, and a shared decision to be at peace with that. Diane cried for approximately 48 hours, and then made an enormous amount of food, because that was how she processed things, and nobody complained. And on a Thursday evening, because of course it was a Thursday, Roland Voss looked up from his tea to find Caden Reese standing in the kitchen doorway. Caden, who was feared by packs across 4 territories. Caden, whose name was shorthand in certain circles for the kind of authority that doesn't require demonstration. Caden, who had faced Dovin's assault without visible tremor and rebuilt a fractured pack through 4 years of sheer, unrelenting will. Caden, who was now holding his tea mug with the slightly too careful grip of a man trying very hard not to look like he was nervous, and asking, in a voice that was about 15% less steady than his usual register, for Roland's permission to court his daughter. He used the word court. Genuinely. In the current year. Roland looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. Nora looked at the ceiling. Roland looked back at Caden. "She's going to say yes," he said. "She talks about you when she thinks I can't hear." Caden looked at Nora. Nora looked at her father with the expression of a woman who has survived a war and an infiltrator and Dovin's entire assault, and is now learning that none of it was as dangerous as having a parent. She said, "You were gone for 7 years, and you're already embarrassing me." Roland smiled into his tea, and Diane from the next room said, "I heard all of that, and I think it's wonderful." Which was somehow worse. This story was never really about werewolves. It was about the people rooms forget about. The quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who learned to take up less space because taking up space always seemed to cost something they couldn't afford. Nora Voss spent 7 years being the person nobody looked at twice. She didn't know that was the whole point. She didn't know that her father had chosen her. Specifically, deliberately. Because the world had underestimated her, and he never had. Not for a single day. It was about the leaders who build walls out of their own warmth because they cannot afford to let anyone see what protecting people costs them. Caden Reese was not cold. He was a man who loved carefully because loving recklessly in his position had a body count. And the bravest thing he ever did wasn't facing Dovin. It was letting a librarian see his hands shake. It was about fathers and daughters and the things we say sideways because we love too much to say them straight. About the messages hidden in margins and book spines and the soft folds of letters read 100 times by someone who didn't yet know she was the safest place in the world. And it was about this, the thing you are most ashamed of, the smallness, the quietness, the way you disappear into rooms, might be the thing someone who loves you placed there deliberately. It might be the armor they built you before they knew you'd need it. Your invisibility might be the reason everything survived. Some things don't need healing. Some things were never broken. They just needed the right person to find them in the margins. That's the story. And if something in it stays with you, if Nora reminded you of yourself, or someone you love, or the version of yourself you were before you realized you were allowed to take up space, then you already know what this channel is about. Stories that do something. Stories you carry out of the room with you. There are more coming. More of this exact feeling. The kind that makes you want to call someone. The kind that sits with you past the ending. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Leave a like if this story earned it. And drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me which part hit you hardest. Tell me if you saw the ending coming, because I genuinely want to know. Every comment, every location, every "I didn't see that coming," it tells me you're here. And as long as you're here, I'll keep telling stories worth staying for.